focusing again on drugs and narcotics. In this area, as many of you probably know, many experts make a distinction between supply side and demand side strategies for addressing the issue. Let's focus on the supply side for a second. What's worked and what hasn't? And Daniel, specifically, give us your thoughts in terms of what's working or hasn't in Colombia, and also the U.S.'s role in Plan Colombia, a very recognized sort of major investment from the U.S.
I guess I'll start with what João was mentioning. I think we can see prohibition as a transfer of the cost from consumer to producer countries, where the intuition is that they push producer countries to reduce supply under the idea that that's going to reduce consumption in producer countries. So in that vein, that was the start of Plan Colombia, which was a strategy to fight against criminal organizations and the production of cocaine. And the main focus of Plan Colombia during many years was in the very initial stage of cocaine production, which is coca crops. And they pushed the idea that by attacking illegal crops by aerial spraying or manual eradication, they would stop the flow of drugs to the U.S. And that has been shown by many different studies to be extremely costly and not very efficient. What worked in Colombia, and the evidence is clear on that, is interdiction, focusing on the parts of the chain that produce the highest value added. That's the wholesale distribution of drugs from Colombia to Mexico, and that's where supply reduction efforts can be effective, at least in the short term. But that creates coordination failures between countries, because when Colombia started being effective in combating illegal drugs trade, the business just shifted to Central America, Mexico. When Mexico is began being effective in quote unquote, the problem shifted back to the Caribbean islands. So we're just pushing the problem somewhere else. I guess supply reduction efforts is a self-defeating policy. By being effective on supply reduction efforts, you increase market rents and you induce more people to get into the market. So I guess whereas supply reduction efforts increase prices, increase market rents, demand reduction efforts actually do the opposite, and they tend to be more successful in reducing actually the problems in Latin America or in producer countries.
Steve.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the bad side. I'll give a little bit of silver lining on Plan Colombia and the way that I see it and how it may reflect in other countries. I think that there is an argument to be made that Plan Colombia and other assistance measures have...
Steve, if you could you just describe in 2 or 3 sentences what, in fact, Plan Colombia is for some of the audience?
A large-scale, multi-pronged assistance package spread over many years to Colombia to mostly assist them in dealing with drug trafficking issues, and mostly as they related to the insurgency, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. That would be my closest description of that. Certainly the part that got most of the press was this idea of coca eradication. There's another aspect of this which has to do with development of institutions, specifically institutions that need to gather intelligence and act on that intelligence in a way that helps them eliminate high-end or high targets, powerful targets of drug trafficking and guerrilla groups. And in this regard, I would say that it was largely a success, and I think actually in a political sphere, supremely important as it was related to mostly luring over time the guerrillas to the negotiating table. So in a way, you could argue that this is part of a larger process of debilitating a large criminal and political organization, obviously, and luring them towards a negotiating table. Certainly there are different ways in which this manifests itself in places like Mexico, and you could argue that the negotiating table in Mexico is much more about things like extradition or which jail you're going to be in and those sorts of things. But the same impact could be had. Calderon, for all his failures, had set about a list of 37 high-level criminals that he that he said he wanted to take down. He captured or killed 25 of them, which by most measures would be a success story. Now, he couldn't sell it very well, but that's a whole other story. But that is part of that process. So if I'm going to look for silver lining in all this, I'm going to look there.
João.
Just amplifying a little bit what Daniel said, if the demand is relatively insensitive to prices, and let's assume that that's the case for most of narcotics in the short run, I guess you write a simple model in which by attacking supply, you actually draw more resources into the industry. And this is possibly why, if you look at the factual, not the counterfactual, if you look at what happened, most people would say, like looking at over the last 20 or 30 years, that quantities transacted haven't gone down. If anything, I think they have gone up. So, of course, we don't know what would have happened absent the war on drugs that was started to be waged like 30 years ago. But I guess but we do know the factual, and the factual suggests that it's not a huge success. So, and as we said, it might be politically sustainable because it shifts most of the costs somewhere else, which is something that we've been mentioning quite a lot here.
Okay. So you've all discussed a number of really significant challenges on the supply side. What about the demand side, the sort of public health oriented side? What's working there? What isn't? What's going on in that area, both in Colombia and in the region at large?
Well, I guess the answer is very short. Despite a lot of rhetoric by former presidents, acting presidents, not much. We all talk about a public health approach towards drug consumption, and if you actually look at the facts, you don't see almost any program working in any country in the region on treatment, prevention, harm reduction, almost nothing. And we have a long way to go to actually approach drug use as a public health problem, and we haven't done that. Despite a lot of rhetoric by many organizations, by many people who actually want to bring a public health approach to drug consumption, we haven't done much in that sense.
Steve.
Yeah, I mean, the easy and continued villain in the drug equation is the United States, but the reality is because of the increased consumption in most of Latin America, all of Latin America. I mean, Argentina per capita consumption, Brazil per capita consumption is basically equal to the United States. Brazil might have surpassed the United States at this stage. And as I said, most of the violence is generated by this local criminal economy. So the easy thing is still for them to say, oh, the consumer countries, the major consumer countries, Europe, United States, Asia mostly, in those spaces, are to blame. But the reality is Latin America has to look in the mirror, and they haven't yet. They haven't looked in the mirror, and they haven't put any resources towards this. And I don't know when that's going to change, but certainly the political rhetoric will have to change to begin with.
Yes, I think we have to do a lot of soul searching on that. I agree totally with Daniel that I don't know of any initiative that was successful in treating drug use as a public health issue. I think we've been moving, several countries have been moving towards at least not treating drug use as a criminal issue. Of course, it's going to be kind of hard to treat it as a public health issue if you treat consumption as a crime. Brazil is one of the examples, although the drug law of 2005 hasn't been totally successful for other reasons, because we didn't count on police enforcement reacting to it. But I agree with Steve. There is a lot of drug consumption there, and is not treated as a public health issue, which should have, and it's really, really disappointing. And part of the blame on that is the rhetoric of shifting the blame to the north. That's true.
And the horrible irony, of course, is that this is what fills up jails and what leads to this prison criminal economy as well, and criminal operations from the prisons. So
right, one of several factors.